At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our next keynote speaker, Acting Director, Deputy Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, Mr. Stan Meiburg. If you've reviewed Mr. Meiburg's bio, you'll have noticed that he served in Region 4 and 6 of EPA, but you notice he kind of skipped Region 5, 2 and 3 for that matter, as I understand, all of the sort of the Great Lakes regions. So welcome to the Great Lakes region for that. I understand he's agreed to come out of retirement to take this position at the request of Administrator Gina McCarthy, which is a sign of real dedication to his public service, and we absolutely appreciate you being here with us today. So thank you very much.
John, thank you very much.
That's great.
Well, John, thank you very much. And yes, it is true. I had what has been described as the most spectacular failed retirement in the history of EPA, having retired in May of 2014 and thinking I was done, but did not know that Bob Percisepi was going to leave a month later. And then I get this phone call when I was driving back from having played golf, which is what I thought I'd be doing in my retirement. And this phone call to the administrator's office, and he picks up the line and says, "Is this your phone?" Well, yes. The administrator's going to call you in half an hour, and you could just hear the footsteps of dread when you get a call like that. But it's a tremendous honor and opportunity, and we have so much good work to do. And John, I really want to thank you again for your introduction to the Great Lakes, and to Tim for the invitation to get a chance to be here. And of course, I've worked with John for many years in connection with the environmental commissions of the states, and I suspect if I spend a little more time looking around, just because I'm such an old timer, I'll see other folks that I've worked with as well. So it's quite an honor to be here. And particularly this year, as this is the, I think the 60th birthday of the Great Lakes Commission. And I'm here to tell you, your 60s are your best years. One would hope. And while I didn't bring a cake or a birthday present, John, I do have one present for you, which is a letter from the administrator in response to your letter, which talks about how we can have some new opportunities for quarterly discussions with the regional working group, and also just to reinforce the message that, that I know she talked to you about herself, which is how committed we are towards partnerships with the states in the Great Lakes region. And that's something that is tremendously important to us, and how grateful we are for the chance to be partners with you in this great work, because it's really just vital to our success. It is really an honor to be here from folks who know just how important the Great Lakes are, because I'm always astonished at this, except when I drive up to Lakeshore Drive and look out and see it all, about how in the Great Lakes there are 80% or 80+% of North America's fresh surface water. And from the region I was in, the southeast, where they were fighting over much smaller quantities of water, I know just how important that is, and the importance to the millions of Americans who depend on the Great Lakes goes beyond just the statistics you could perhaps recite. And while I will freely admit that I'm a Southerner, I'm from North Carolina. Occasionally I'm told that the reason the administrator appointed me is not because she wanted somebody who talked like she does. If you've ever heard Gina McCarthy speak, you'll know what I'm talking about. But I do, from that, gain an appreciation for water, and little as might be thought for a Southerner, I actually did spend some time here in the Great Lakes region. It was only 1 year, but it was an important year. It was my senior year in high school when I lived in Rochester, New York. So I got to see Lake Ontario there. My father was a seminary professor at the Colgate-Rochester Divinity School. For any of you who know Rochester, it's the one place in town that sits up on top of a hill. And so spent a great year there. I learned all about what it means to have a climate that has 10 months of winter and 2 months of poor sledding. At least in those days, maybe climate change will affect that, I don't know, but tested out that hill with a sled, and I'm lucky to still be here alive to tell the story. But it really did give me sort of a connection as part of my past to the importance of the Great Lakes. I know to that particular region it was just vital to the city and to the whole area. And can only, in my experience since then, I've had the pleasure to be in many parts of this region and know just how vital and important it is. And the history of the Great Lakes and their protection is really bound up in the history of the country and the environmental movement as well. It's been a center of transportation and trade for as long as America has basically been around. And it's very noted in the history of the environmental movement that people think about the Cuyahoga River and they think about Lake Erie and all of those things as one of the founding impulses that led to the creation of EPA in 1970. I understand at one point there was a proposal to sell water from Lake Superior that did not go over well. Yes, I'm seeing some nods around the room. But it did, you know, to the extent that some of these things can spark a new consciousness for water conservation, that's a very important consequence of that. And, you know, you can go on and on and on, but it's clear that the Great Lakes are a tremendous resource environmentally, economically, and in terms of the overall culture of this region, and it's something we at EPA value tremendously and want to continue to respect. And it's also striking to me that the community here has a wonderful national reputation for constructive collaboration, and that's not true in every part of the country, and it's something you should all be very proud of. Because here you find that businesses and environmental groups actually talk to each other, that I'm sure that you've had your share of litigation over the years, but there's been a lot of constructive communication, and that's a great value in a world which too often seems polarized. And it's the preservation of those partnerships, federal, state, local, non-governmental organizations, private sector companies, all working together on behalf of a shared resource that really is of value and important. And we at EPA rely on the expertise that comes from all of you and from this commission and all the interests that you represent. And I want to express my personal commitment as well as the commitment of Administrator McCarthy to listen, to work side by side with you in behalf of this great resource. So I want to talk just a little bit about some of the things we're doing at EPA today, and I would be remiss if I did not start with the Great Lakes Regional Initiative, or Restoration Initiative, depending on you how you want to describe it. And Cam will probably beat me up later if I got the name wrong. But it's a great initiative, and I want to give you some update on our prospects for sustaining this in the coming years. The Obama administration has really worked very hard to sustain it and will continue to do so during the remaining term of this administration. It has tremendously broad bipartisan support in an era when many of the things we do, that's not so much. And so that's something we especially value, and this would not be possible without the great work of this commission. Anytime we receive recommendations about how to improve and strengthen that program, we pay close attention to it. We were very pleased with the recent Government Accountability Report on the GLRI, which found no significant issues, and that may sound like a kind of a faint praise, but it's really not. There are organizations whose job it is to find issues, and the fact they would come forward with a report that strong was really a positive statement. And there's a hearing on the Hill later this week to cover, I think, the possibility of Great Lakes reauthorization, and the administration recognizes that a strong effort to support and restore this fresh water supply is really vital for tens of millions of Americans and supports legislative efforts that will promote the stability of this initiative. So I hope that that will go well, and we're looking forward to it. Now, I also know that our ability to continue to command that support, as well as the binational counterpart of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, has a lot to do with the role of the states in promoting and planning and implementing commitments under both those initiatives. And to strengthen our communications, in the letter I just handed John, we're making sure to invite all the GLRI agencies to engage in the regular quarterly discussions with our regional working group that we have. And I think that was a call recently, last month, to invite states to continue to make sure to coordinate with us on all the challenges and concerns, successes, and things we need to learn better how to do, and in addition to all the ongoing opportunities that we have for consultation. And there are quite a few. For example, consultation on the areas of concern planning, which is very important here, and the cleanup, so we can continue to restore and delist those sites and make more of those appear as stars on that map and not just dots. The Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee, which is co-chaired by the Fish and Wildlife Service and EPA, and I know states have been playing a very active role in continuing to work on keeping this aquatic threat from becoming established in the lakes, as well as the Lake-wide Action and Management Plan partnerships under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. That's a lot of structures and may sound like a lot of sort of process-oriented stuff, but the folks who are working on that are doing great things that will build a sustainable future for the partnerships that we have and for great accomplishments moving ahead. And I also know, and we've been watching this very carefully from the EPA end, that one of the particular concerns of states and provinces is a continued threat to health of water quality from harmful algal blooms, and from hypoxia, and that's been a big issue in the western end of Lake Erie this year, as well as I understand in the area around Green Bay and Saginaw Bay. And so I think we all learned some lessons from our experience last summer. I remember when I was during that period of great retirement, I was sort of listening to this and thinking, oh gosh, that's terrible about Toledo. And it's glad to see that everybody has learned from some of those experiences and I think been better prepared so that even though the blooms have been there, we've been in a better position to deal with them. And I really want to commend all the folks who've been working on that, especially in the state of Ohio. And I think you may have seen that we are continuing to target some of our grant funding at nutrient reductions and supporting states and non-governmental organizations and other entities who are working on that. I also want to note that we've invested tens of millions of dollars, including the request for application to support easement purchases in the Maumee River watershed, riparian areas, as well as other nutrient reduction approaches. It's really interesting to watch how the Clean Water Act and the focus of the Act has really been shifting over the last 10 to 20 years. That in the early days of the Act, there was tremendous focus on point sources and technology control. And those were vital and critical because that was what you needed to do in those days. But as that has moved forward, we're finding that the non-point source side, whether it's stormwater, other forms of runoff, has been important as we focus more on a water quality oriented aspect. In fact, it's kind of fascinating to watch the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which have sort of gone in different directions, with the Clean Air Act starting as an ambient focus, moving more and more towards how do we implement great technologies. The Clean Water Act, which started with technologies, is really looking at ambient water quality and how you can use that to drive an appropriate use of the tools. Now, it's an adjustment for EPA because we had engineers who were really good at the technology side, but some of the non-point source controls require a lot of the soft skills, partnerships, working together, finding ways you can implement some of those things. And so that's been kind of a culture change for EPA that we're working on very hard, but can only do it, again, if there's a common theme to this conversation, it is with partnerships with many other people. We're also working at the national level to give the Great Lakes a boost, and I want to highlight a couple of those efforts. Just again on hazardous algal blooms, we issued, as I think probably most of you know, in May, some health advisory values, which were not regulations, but they were information that states and utilities can help use to protect residents from elevated levels of algal toxins in drinking water and hopefully help to make some of the conversations this summer easier than the ones last year. Administrator McCarthy said when we released these values that, and I'll quote here, nutrient pollution and harmful algal blooms are among America's most serious and growing environmental challenges. And we want to keep working closely with our partners at the state and local levels on monitoring, treating, and communicating about the toxins, as well as addressing the sources of nutrients that fuel HABs. So that's been a big deal for us, and we're working on similar values for recreational waters as well. And this is in response to a tremendous, really outcry across the whole country, not just in this region. The second thing we're doing is working to protect wetlands, and the Great Lakes states have lost millions of acres of wetlands over the recent decades. But to first make sure that we can continue to protect our remaining wetlands, we got to make sure we can properly delineate them, and that's what the Clean Water Rule is all about. This has been a source of confusion for a long time, and there are folks here in the room who could recite the whole history of court cases involving delineation of wetlands much better than I can. But the whole point of the Clean Water Rule was to do two things. One was to make sure we were in fact protecting all waters that need to be protected. Everybody's downstream from somewhere, and you wanted to make sure that the upstream things were covered so that the downstream values could be protected. And the second thing was to provide some clarity. We heard loud and clear that the case-by-case delineation process was creating a lot of confusion about what was in and what was out, and we tried really hard in this 4-page rule to lay out those things in ways that provide more clarity and make the job that we all have simpler. So those were really our objectives. I know there's been a lot of controversy about this and concerns and anxiety. We're continuing to reach out with our partners, the Corps of Engineers, and I know Joella Murphy will be here later today and can talk about that as well. But to try to lay out and use this, it's in effect now in 37 states. We have the one injunction from North Dakota, the District Court in North Dakota. But from the legal side, we are very much looking forward to getting all of these challenges consolidated in one circuit, and then we'll have the hearing, which hopefully, and the decision, which we think will uphold the value of this rule in achieving the objectives I just described. The third thing I wanted to mention is an effort that doesn't quite as much ink as the first two. And in fact, I suspect some of you may not have heard of this, or at least have heard about it, and didn't necessarily think, well, how is this connected to the Great Lakes? And that is something we at EPA and with our state partners call e-enterprise. And I want to make sure for those states here that you tell Tom Burek that I did shout out on this because he'll really care about it. But for folks who've been very involved in this, it's really important because e-enterprise is kind of a wonky name, and when people hear about it, they think somehow this is going to be the next, like, you know, Google site or something like that. And I'm here to tell you, it really is much more about that. It really is about modernizing the business of environmental protection. And when you say modernizing the business of environmental protection, it includes a lot of things. It includes, obviously, better interconnection of data systems, to be sure, but it's far more than that. EPA and states interact in a whole range of ways under the structure of our nation's environmental statutes, and we're looking for ways to do that better, to streamline our joint processes, to make sure that we are, in fact, adding value at the different steps of our work, and to engage in something that is kind of a nice term, but to execute it is real work, and that is joint governance. Something I suspect this commission knows a lot about over your 60 years of history, but working on ways which we can move forward together. We're in a different place on governance for the environmental enterprise than we were when EPA was formed in 1970. And it's really, this is an opportunity for us to take time to think about what that actually means and build the kind of partnerships that we need to do so that the environmental enterprise of the future moves forward in strong and healthy ways. And just to highlight one thing that just occurred on Friday, which is really great and an example of this, that last week EPA finalized a rule at long last after, I think, 8 years of work to modernize reporting for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, using existing information technology to electronically report required data instead of filing written paper reports. Again, this may seem like a no-brainer in this modern age, but to us it's really a big deal. It will save states $22.6 million a year when the rule is fully implemented, and I was delighted to see Alex Dunn's quote in our press release that highlighted state support for this, and will also make the reported information searchable and accessible to the public, and will be searchable and accessible, frankly, to ourselves. I don't know how many stories I've heard over the years of NPDES reports that came in big paper boxes and would just sit there, and there was no way to really analyze the data and make the use of it in ways that could help us better and more efficiently target our work. This is going to be a tremendous benefit for all of us, and so getting that rule across the finish line and signed is a very big deal, and we're really proud of it. And it's also very consistent, and I see Dave Ulrich sitting in there, and I just wanted to give him a little shout out because this rule is going to be very consistent with platforms for data management sharing that the Great Lakes Advisory Board has been advocating for some time, and that I'll hear more about this afternoon. So it's just good all the way around. So with that, I could probably go on for a long time, but I would rather spend a little, if I have a little time, to just answer questions. But first, again, just to thank all of you for the great work you're doing, for working with us to help ensure that the Great Lakes Initiative is a stable and thriving program, and that states are indeed complete and full partners in this effort. And this will enable us, hopefully, to leave the program as strong as possible when the administration finishes up its work in January of 2017. And with that, I hope that the reach out will be something that you're looking forward to, and that we will continue to work together to protect the waters that mean so much to really the entire nation. And thank you very much for the chance to be here.
Thank you for that. I would open the floor to any questions from the commission. Don't be shy.
But don't feel like you have to come up with a question that will be unanswerable either.
Well, let me start with one.
Okay. Fire away.
So it's good
and then John has one after you do.
Okay. Well, John, why don't you go ahead first? I'm sorry, I didn't see you over there.
I just wanted to thank you and thank the administrator for her consideration of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative needs of states, and for ongoing purposes to support the capacity that states have built to implement programs that do build partnerships and sustain those partnerships. And I know, so your letter is very much appreciated. I wanted to ask you about the ongoing work to address public health issues. This is one of the things that is near and dear to my heart, having worked in our state health department and in various environmental capacities. One of the things that I think I would like to hear from EPA is how public health outcomes are improving or changing as a result of environmental protection efforts.
John's asking me a question that he's asked before, and he's particularly well positioned to do this, that there aren't, it's interesting, when you look at the history of environmental protection, most of the state programs that you have that were the core of state departments of environmental quality came in large part out of departments of public health. And because of the growth of federal legislation in particular, there was a long period when it just became too much, and in all but I think 5 states it was separated out. And in some ways that period of sort of bureaucratic organization was probably necessary in many places, but it has in some ways weakened the ties that we used to have to public health. And this is something that John rightly points to, the fact that we need in fact to be tied together, because whether it's in air pollution or drinking water in particular, not to mention other kind of efforts that EPA engages in, there's a very direct link, and it's something that really is important and that people care deeply about. And our challenge is to bring the science of public health into bear in this conversation, because anxiety is one thing, but things that help address anxiety are something else. And in many cases, folks in the public health community are in some ways better skilled than we are in that area of public health and risk communication, but also provide confidence, because let's face it, EPA is a controversial agency, and there's some places where if I just walk in the room and say I'm from EPA, it's like the curtain descends and it's hard to even have a communication. Now we think we can improve that by improving some of our soft communication skills, but doing it together with our partners in public health is really important. And for me personally, I had the opportunity to spend 2 years of my career as a liaison between EPA and CDC, and the one thing I took away from that is that EPA is run by lawyers and CDC is run by doctors. And sometimes you felt like you were having to do sort of translation between those two cultures. Well, we'd like to see if we can get past that, and I can point to a couple of specific things. One is that our new science advisor, Tom Burke, came from the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and Tom gets it, having been involved in that world in New Jersey, as well as being an eminently respected scientist and academic in the public health arena. So you got someone in charge of that great resource of EPA that really understands it. And we just brought on board as sort of the deputy science advisor, Tom Sinks, who I actually worked with when I was at CDC, when he was with NCH and ATSDR as a deputy director. So we got some sort of human infrastructure in place to help build those partnerships, as well as the partnerships that occur in all of our regional offices, where we also encourage reach out to state departments of public health. And the more we can do that, the better off we are. So you're exactly on point with your question. Thank you. John, you had a question also.
I did. So we've heard from a couple of speakers earlier about 2 things. One is the importance of data and data integration as we move from sort of compliance monitoring, if you will, to really true systems integration and systems management. So that's one of the pieces that I'd like to hear a little bit your perspective on how EPA will continue to work towards that long-term goal of what true systems management looks like. And if you will, we just heard previously around the power of technology and technological innovation towards those endpoints, both on the economic side, the entrepreneurial side, recognizing that technology uptake from wastewater treatment plants and others is complicated. It's complicated both regulatorily. It is not a place where experimentation has always been the most on the forefront because of certain public health considerations and others. How do you tie those together, both on the information systems management, and where technology will play in the future?
It's very interesting, John, because I actually had the same question over at WEFTEC earlier this morning on technology and innovation. And in some ways, the answer is the same for data integration as well, and that's adaptive management. And the reason I say that is because when you look at systems and data integration, where EPA has had its biggest problem is when we got into what I call the old sort of, I'm about to use a pejorative term, which maybe I shouldn't use, centralized planning model of data integration. And that was that you would come up with we would give a task to a bunch of people who were supposed to go off and design the system and then deliver it fully blown, and then expect it was going to work perfectly. And that process hadn't really worked that well. We are very much trying now with some of our data systems to adopt a more adaptive management approach to data, where you can do break pieces of systems out, try it, brainstorm it, make sure the techie is at the table, so to speak. So instead of just sort of say, okay, here's what we want, go figure it out, it's you have this dialogue between the people who are the users of the system and folks who know the technology, working it out section by section, so you can have an adaptive management approach to that. I think you'll see that in working on the EPA state data integration side, and one of the sort of hallmarks, I think, of e-enterprise will be that point. So that's the answer there. And on technology innovation, in some ways, it's the same thing. There are a lot of institutional barriers to technology innovation. Some of them are sort of physics barriers, and some of them are the barriers that exist between your ears about we never did it that way before. And usually my experience has been that when you find yourself meeting, you have and I'm going to use a sort of wonky term here, a force field diagram, for any of you who ever did total quality management. In a force field diagram, let's say you have your end state here, and your where you are is here, and you're trying to move the line toward the desired end state. Well, people's initial sense is, oh, well, if we just put more force here, then we can just push it through all these barriers. That tends to not work very well, because there's sort of a Newton's law of change that says you have to, that for every action there's equal and opposite reaction. Instead, what is more useful is that if you find where the resistance is coming from and act on that directly to reduce its strength, then you'll move toward the goal on its own. Now, that's a little sort of management wonky kind of stuff, but nevertheless, the point I think is well taken on technology innovation is figure out where the barrier is. For example, with gray water reuse, the chief barrier turns out to be conservatism on the part of local health departments who don't want to be ever involved in permitting something that creates disease. Well, they're less likely to listen to EPA than they are to CDC. And so therefore you work with a partnership with CDC to say, hey, look, when you do things this way, it's okay. And that can be a very helpful and powerful motivator. So I think technological, and that's exactly the same message I said at WEFTEC, that there are so many great ideas out there. You have to be able to figure out ways to test them at scale and find out where the actual root cause of the resistance is and work on that, which can be education and culture and just the way in which things have historically been done.
One more question.
Thanks, Dan. It was a great talk, and I very much enjoyed it. I have a question for your perspective on this. A lot of us dealing with water quality problems, particularly hard-pressed urban areas, poor rural areas, and the like, and realizing that you're coming up on your 45th anniversary at EPA, and the Clean Water Act at its start was really as much a regulatory law as it was an infrastructure funding law.
Yep.
And, and we're finding throughout this country, a lot of the water works that were built with the original construction grant programs are now coming to the end of their useful life. And the bill is really coming home. We're seeing a lot of articles on this nationally, a lot of reports on the status of the infrastructure. Maybe you could share your thoughts about how do we, as states, as localities, as the federal agencies together, succeed without adequate funding to address infrastructure, clean water infrastructure, and also to assist farmers on the landscape in addressing their nitrogen and phosphorus pollution problems. Thank you.
Man. Oh boy, yeah, right, in under a minute. Obviously, there's no simple answer to that question. I would just note a couple of things. One is that you're quite right about the Clean Water Act. People forget that the 1972 Clean Water Act was vetoed because it was thought to be a budget buster, and then the veto was overridden. Hard to believe, today, but it was. And then there was a lot of concern on the implementation of it when it first rolled out in terms of how much money was going to be available. It was bound up in a very interesting time in our country's history about the balance of relationships between the president and the Congress. Sound familiar? But the theory at the time was that the nation needed a shot in the arm, if you will, on the infrastructure side to overcome a long period of neglect, and the resources needed to come from the federal agency to give a push. It was envisioned in those days as a one-time push, but that the operation and maintenance of these things over time was going to be a state and local responsibility. I think one of the challenges we've always had is doing both full cost pricing and sustainable maintenance of infrastructure, because unfortunately the sewers and pipes tend to be sort of out of sight, out of mind, and that's been a challenge for us. I know, and I talked some about that again at WEFTEC, about some of the leadership in communities like Atlanta, which we were very involved in, which took a very activist mayor to say, look, I know this is out of sight, out of mind, but this is a public health challenge, and we need to deal with it. And that's was astonishing to me. So I think there are two things in response to your question. One is we've got to continue to sort of get the message out there that the one-time infrastructure from our parents is one that we have to now sustain for the future, and that is, in fact, our responsibility. And the second thing is, though, I think it may be time to do some thinking again about, given now where we are, and have it do a fact-based analysis, and it would need to be by some outside independent group. I don't think EPA by itself has it's just not in a position where you could necessarily do this, but a group that says, what does this mean? We've had very successful engagement with our state revolving loan funds, which have given out like $133 billion of assistance, but there are communities still in this country which can't even afford to service 0% loans. And so, what does this mean? Our overall total needs is about $600 billion. We've set up this new Water Infrastructure and Resiliency Finance Center to help bring in new resources from the private sector into the system, as well as to make sure the resources we have are working as hard as they can. We've stolen Jim Gephardt to come down to Washington to help us think about that. But I think there's some real challenges we have on making sure the resources we have are working as hard as they need to. So those are just a couple off the cuff reactions to your question, which is a very good one.
Please join me in thanking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Good to meet you.
You too. Again, thank you for very thoughtful comments and for really understanding, listening to the Commission and the Commission's concerns. And I'll have a chance to take a look at the letter here in a bit. So I didn't read it while you were talking, so that's good.